Test. Test.
Testing 2, 3. Yes. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello, Tristan. Good to see you. All right. It is so good to have all of you here on this afternoon as we get ready for the food truck party. Brick and ladder pizza. But before we get there, Ron and I have had an absolute amazing experience. Bill, Lauren, if you guys can go ahead and pull up the first slide, please. An absolute amazing experience from April 18th through the 24th. We were blessed to be able to go on a racial justice pilgrimage that covered these areas: Memphis, Tennessee, Birmingham, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, and Selma, Alabama. Next slide, please. Now, these are the goals for this pilgrimage. One, as far as participant transformation, to acknowledge the living legacy of white supremacy in our country and to understand how far we have come and how far we have yet to go to achieve racial reconciliation and equity, to learn and reflect on the history of white racial violence in the U.S., to recognize and appreciate the strengths of the African American community to resist white supremacy in the struggle for freedom, to increase awareness of white unconscious bias, to debrief our experience of racial trauma in our bodies, hearts, and minds, to create a bond and network among participants, to encourage future discussion and collaboration, to promote racial reconciliation in our own churches and communities. Now, this pilgrimage was the brainchild of Grace Presbytery's Social Justice Task Force, of which I am a member. I'll get to that here in a little while. The original plan was for the pilgrimage to be a way for the task force to bond, because we were coming from different areas. But COVID hit, and we weren't able to actually get that off. Well, by the time we were able to put the pilgrimage together, COVID had subsided to a degree, if you will, and as a task force, we had already come together and we were learning more about each other, so we decided we should open this up to anyone who wants to go, and we think this can be an amazing experience, and so we did. So the second tier, the second tier of the pilgrimage goals are these. Please, next screen. So, Reverend June Cooper and Dr. Mari Embers were our guides on this pilgrimage, and they were amazing, both from Boston, Massachusetts. As you'll see here in a moment, they are of two different races, if you will, and that was intentional to be able to show a collaboration effort in this regard. That was done purposefully. Now, to have demonstrated throughout the pilgrimage the particular skills needed to process emotional, difficult material and experiences as individuals and as a group, and to manage tension and conflict as well, as it may well arise. We did not have there were no fights that broke out on the pilgrimage, but there was always a possibility because of the material that we were looking at was challenging. It was challenging. So these safeguards were put into place to consciously engage Presbyterian members in thoughtful reflection and debriefing, not only on how the pilgrimage has been transforming, but to the critical role leadership skills and interventions, etc., played in the overall experience of the pilgrimage. And then to prepare Grace Presbytery's members to lead future racial justice equity pilgrimages in subsequent years, next year, 2024, 2025. So we'll see if that actually happens. It's going to be up to Grace Presbytery if that's what Grace wants to do. Okay, Ron, now I did not go by myself. Ron Harrison also went along, and Ron was my roommate. And let me tell you something. With the exception of Kay and Terry, I think we were absolutely meant to be together. And this was, it was a wonderful experience. I truly enjoyed being on this pilgrimage with Ron. So we had a wonderful, wonderful time. Ron, anything that you want to say at this moment? And next slide, please.
Now, we were great roommates because I would go to bed early and then he could just stay out all night if he wanted to. I'm such a sound sleeper and I use a CPAP machine, so I was a good roommate for him and he was for me because I was asleep when he'd come in. But we had a good time. We have always cut up ever since.
That's right.
That first meeting that I met him at Bill Miller's house when Perrin was coming here. In fact, after he gave us a presentation and sat down, I asked Terry if she would like to tell us the real truth about this. And so we've kind of hit it off ever since.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ron. Okay, so these are pictures of Reverend June on the left in the first picture, and then on the right in the red jacket on the right picture, and then Dr. Embers. They have done these before, and actually they advised us as to how to do a pilgrimage. And our committee out of the task force, which was made of Reverend Tom Givens, Reverend Dr. David Batchelder, and Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Callender. Elizabeth Callender has been here to preach many times in the past. They were the ones who put together the pilgrimage, and they really thought it would be in the best interest of everyone if members of the Social Justice Task Force did not take a upfront leadership role. So we asked for Reverend Cooper and Dr. Embers if they would come and manage the pilgrimage for us, and they agreed to do so. So that was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity in that regard. Now, Reverend Cooper is a pastor in the American Baptist Church, and Dr. Embers is an educator and strategist of organizational change in human resources development and diversity leadership initiatives, and they had their stuff together. I was thoroughly impressed with both of them. Okay, next slide, please. This is us. 20 persons went on this tour. On this pilgrimage. 20 folks. And we were on a 44 or 45, I think, passenger seat bus, which meant everyone had their own row, which was very nice. I'm not a bus traveler. Ron enjoys riding on buses. I do not. So it was great to be able to have my own row on the bus and be able to stretch out. Including we had one young man who was a student, high school student, who got to come out for this week because his mom was also on the pilgrimage, who was about 6'5", and he got 2 rows. He was able to stretch across 2 of them. So, but anyway, this is the group minus our 2 facilitators. Now, one last thing before we actually get to it. This, again, was not a vacation. It was not a tour. It's intentionally called a pilgrimage because it was a journey for all of us, a journey of self-awareness and discovery, and also challenge. Ron and I both remarked as to, we did a lot of walking on this, and we were both tired many times. But that's what a pilgrimage is about. It is not for your enjoyment as much as it is for your enlightenment. Okay, next slide, please. So the first stop was Memphis, Tennessee. Next slide. So one of the places that we got the chance to go and how we began the pilgrimage was going to Stax Museum of American Soul Music. And that was a really great place to go. What you see right where you see Stax, that middle picture is a Hammond organ. Now, in the black church, you really don't get to do what you're supposed to do without a Hammond. You have to have that organ. When it comes to preaching, that's the organ that cues the preacher up. And that's the organ that will really push the choir and all of these types of things. It's an amazing, amazing piece. And I saw that in the museum, and I shared that with some folks. And then we would, a church that we would visit later, they actually had a Hammond in the church. Now, that far side picture is just a replica of an old black church out in the country. And these are the types of churches, to a degree, that my family and I used to frequent quite often, and especially my family down in Deep, Alabama. These were the types of churches that we would go to. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite things in the museum. This is Isaac Hayes' car. Now, I took a lot of pictures of Isaac Hayes' car, but I only put these two on there. Now, Isaac Hayes is, he is deceased now, but he was a huge R&B artist out of the 70s and early 80s. One of the songs that he put out was the theme song to the movie Shaft. I think he got an Oscar for that one. He got several Grammys as well. His nickname was Black Moses, not because he let anybody out of something, because he had this really thick black beard that he wore all the time and no hair on top of his head. I mean, he was but an incredible artist just the same. But one of the things that impressed me about Stax was the videos, the interviews of the various artists that we got a chance to see. And one in particular talked about how Stax Records was a great collaboration of people from different ethnicities for a very long time. And everyone loved each other, and everyone worked together. From artists to sound engineers to the office staff, it was a beautiful collection of peoples, if you will, until the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. there in Memphis. Once that happened in 1968, they said that the entire company began to experience a great divide. And it was challenging for them to continue to work together. And unfortunately, that brought about the close of Stax in 1975. So we began our pilgrimage there at the Stax Museum. Okay, next slide, please.
Elvis Presley also was involved at the Stax Museum.
Absolutely, Elvis was there. A great story. This is not about Stax, but it does work with Memphis to a degree. A lot of people were not aware, including me, that Conway Twitty and Sam Cooke were friends. They were friends, and they used to record out of the same studio. And they wanted to record an album together, but they didn't think that this country was ready for that. So they never did. Never did. But this was the relationships, or these were the relationships that existed in Memphis, Tennessee at this particular time. Later on our trip in Memphis, we also went to MIFA, which is the Metropolitan Interfaith Association. This is an area that works with programs for seniors and families. And one of the things that I found very interesting about this is that they've got volunteers that come from all over the country to work in this particular center throughout the course of the year. And what they work hard on in this particular nonprofit agency is not to ignore color, to embrace it, but to see the needs of people. People. Doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. If you fall in the category, if you will, by which they work and serve, they're there for you. So we had a really good visit with them. Next slide, please. How can you go to Memphis and not get some good old-fashioned Tennessee barbecue? How can you make a trip like that? So we did. We went to Central Barbecue, or Central Market Barbecue in Memphis. You can see Ron on the back end waving. This is the whole group. At my table on the edge is Lisa. She was our bus driver for the entire trip. She was supposed to get some relief, and relief never came. And she drove us all over the place, and was a wonderful person to have. And if you ever get a chance in Memphis, I've been there a couple of times, that really is a good spot for barbecue and banana pudding. If you like banana pudding, please don't pass that up if you get a chance to go there. All right, next slide, please. Now, on our last day in Memphis, we stopped at the National Civil Rights Museum, which is the Lorraine Motel. The Lorraine Motel is where Dr. King was assassinated. So for a long time, the museum was just the hotel, but they got funding and they were able to build it into something absolutely amazing. So when we got there, one of the first questions that was asked was, when did the civil rights movement begin? When did it start? You know, and some of us said, well, Reconstruction. You know, I think that was the earliest statement that I heard from our group. But our tour guide said, the civil rights movement started in 1619. 1619, when the first African slaves were brought to this country. And there were actually slaves. The first Africans brought to this country were not slaves, they were indentured servants. But then after them, another group came that were slaves. And I believe it was the group on the Amistad. And there's a movie that's about that, a really good movie. But one of the things that I want you to see, and it's going to be hard to see with this particular picture, but all of the indentations really on this sculpture are slaves, enslaved people, okay? And they're all moving north to escape enslavement. But what is really interesting, and it's going to be difficult to see, but they make the shape or the outline of the United States of America. If you look at it, you can see a dip down on the end, which is Florida, a dip in the middle, which is supposed to be Texas, and all the way around. But they shape the United States of America. Yes. We couldn't get that close to it, but Ron, what are you, 6'3"? So Ron is 6'3". It was much taller than Ron. So my guess is probably about 10 feet is what you were looking at with that sculpture. Okay, Ron, anything you want to share about this particular museum? We got some other ones that we got.
Not about the museum, but we did have a lot of barbecues at that place. I'm still thinking about it.
Yes, we ate well.
They had different size sandwiches, and I said, well, I want the regular, and it was like a plate full of barbecue stacked up. I had a hard time flopping my lip over the edge of the bun.
There was plenty to eat that was there, that's for certain. Okay, next slide, please. All right, these are just a couple of shots from inside the museum. The one on this, the far right, that of a sanitation truck, just so that you will, just to remind you, what brought Dr. King to Memphis was a sanitation worker strike, because two African American sanitation workers got trapped in a truck like this and were killed. And nothing was done as far as the family was concerned, benefits and all of these particulars, so they went on strike. And Dr. King came to support them in that effort. And you can see in that very first slide, sometimes you see that same phrase on our marquee here at the church. Be the change that you want to see in the world. Okay. Oh, yeah, next slide, please. This is a good one. That's Ron getting off the bus. In many of the museums we went to, you saw buses, because the civil rights movement that we are accustomed to speaking of began with the Montgomery bus boycott. So a lot of these museums, you see buses. On this particular bus, you had a guy speaking coming across on the speaker, saying, "Get in the back of the bus. You're not supposed to sit here. Get in the back of the bus, or get off the bus." And Ron got off the bus. So, that's a good shot of Ron.
Notice that I am wearing a mask. We were required to wear a mask.
Yeah.
Another thing is,
Yeah, hit that. There you go.
now then, another thing about the trip, every time I got off the bus, I sat close to the front, and when I got off the bus, I waited down at the bottom to help each person get off the bus. Most of these preachers had not traveled as much as Kay and I had, and a lot of women, and especially the older ones, really appreciated that. So they wouldn't slip and slide. So therefore, when we went to eat, I was always last in line because I got off first in the bus to help people off.
Got off.
So I don't know if I learned my lesson or not,
But you still got to eat, Ron.
yeah, I did. We missed it.
All right, next slide, please. This is just a replica of Dr. King's room there at the Lorraine Motel. All right, next slide. So from Memphis, we go to Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham has been nicknamed back during the 60s, Bombingham. And one of the reasons why is, the next slide, please. So, I got family in Birmingham. I know Birmingham very well. I know the suburbs of Birmingham very well. Traveled around that city quite a bit, but I had yet to be able to make my way to this place, the 16th Street Baptist Church. Now, do y'all remember the significance of this place? Okay. This, well, next slide, please. Here it is. So, on September 15th, 1963, a bomb exploded, killing 4 little girls attending Sunday school. Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robeson, Cynthia Wesley, and Denise McNair. Now, our tour guide for this church, as well as for Kelly Ingram Park, was Barry McNeely. He was amazing to be able to share all the stories that were connected in this regard. But this begins, to a degree, the nickname of Bombingham for Birmingham, Alabama. Next slide, please. Now, after this bombing happened in 1963, of course, the church was heavily damaged. There was a stained glass window of Jesus Christ where his face was blown off during the explosion. Now, oddly enough, the rest of that glass window stayed intact. And the church went ahead and kept that stained glass window, and it's in the sanctuary on the floor level with the face of Jesus missing. They did not replace the face of Jesus with this stained glass window. So this faceless Jesus is showing that Jesus' hurt and shame continues by what had been done there. But the church reopened on June 7th of 1964. They received more than $300,000 from around the world. People were concerned about what had happened there. $300,000. Now, that's a lot of money in the 60s, okay? Now, on June 6, however, 1965, the church received this picture of a black crucified Jesus from a group of individuals in Wales. Sent it to them. Now, even before Barry was able to talk about this picture, I saw it when we walked into the sanctuary because it was so different from all of the other stained glass pieces in there. And I looked at it, and then we got a chance to get a little history about this picture. So if you take a look at it, you can see one hand of Jesus is closed, and the other hand is open. The closed hand basically represents Jesus protecting people from all of the hatred and the bigotry and the prejudice and the racism that can hurt and harm, that does hurt and harm individuals, while the open hand is one for love and peace and justice to be extended to all people. Now, if you look really closely at the horizontal white beam on the stained glass window, if you look really closely, you can see it looks like little bitty dots, almost as if there's a mistake. There's been something that was not done correctly with this stained glass piece. But those dots are there on purpose because those dots represent bullets. Bullets that pierce the body of Christ. And unfortunately, I couldn't get the bottom part clear enough with this picture, but at the bottom of the stained glass window, you have the words, "You do it to me. You do it to me." Next slide. So, when the civil rights movement really began to amp up, it's because the world began to pay attention to what was happening in the South here in the U.S. And the only way the world could pay attention was to actually see things that were occurring. Next slide, please. So, after our tour of 6th Street Baptist Church, we went to Kelly Ingram Park. And while we were there, the whole park, there's a trail around the park that basically talks about the march on Birmingham that would eventually put Dr. King in jail. Well, what the world saw, and you all have seen the images, you've seen the pictures before. So you have Bull Connor, and of course you got George Wallace of Alabama, Bull Connor, who is basically running Birmingham. And as these protesters continue to make their statement and express themselves, express their displeasure there in Birmingham, Bull Connor gets firefighters, and they bring out these water cannons. And the water cannons they use on protesters. Now, what makes this image challenging is that the sculpture of the people in front of the water cannon are children. Children. Now, that was strategic. Don't get me wrong. I don't want you to think that they were walking home from school and this just happened. No, it was strategic. Dr. King and then Reverend Dr. Fred Shuttlesworth, who was the Dr. King of Birmingham, if you will, had a plan to be able to get the world to see what was being done to people of color here in the United States of America. And these families and their children volunteered to be a part of the movement, knowing that this type of punishment, this type of violence rather, was going to be done. And the way that Barry explained, these water cannons could almost peel the skin off of you. That's the type of pressure that they had. Ron, you
Yeah, they aimed the water cannons at some trees, and it actually stripped the trees of the bark. And if you got that much pressure, you can imagine what it would do to a human being. I mean, it was so pathetic. And in this park, they had statues all over about the pain and the hurt that these people were enduring.
Yes. Next slide, please. So if water cannons were not enough, they also used police dogs. And these sculptures